So we're going to take a quick look at compression limiting and the different applications of it in mixing. Now, if you haven't used limiters before, in case you didn't know, the way that limiters differ from ordinary compressors is that what compressors do is they take a signal, such as we'll isolate a little area here, and they reduce the dynamic range by determining a certain threshold and bringing levels down so that there's less dynamic range. There's less of a difference between the peaks and the lower parts of the mix. Now, what limiting does, by contrast, is it determines a maximum headroom that a signal cannot exceed. Now, let's say when you're mastering, that headroom is close to 0 dB, which is the maximum headroom before clipping. So it'd be much like doing this, raising the amplitude of the entire signal of an entire mix, and then at the very top, where the peaks are exceeding the maximum headroom, you're going to get a rounding at best and a clipping at worst of the entire signal, because it can't exceed that point. It just clamps right down on it. And that's why you always have to be careful with limiting, because it pretty much destroys that information. You can't get that back. Once you create a rounded off or squared result like that, it's instead of having those little peaks and valleys, when you zoom right in, you're gonna get a squaring off of these peaks. You see? So you always have to be judicious in how you go about using limiting. So we'll put up a limiter. All right. So without even playing this audio, what we know about the audio ahead of time is the maximum amplitude of the track is in this area here. And the peaks at this maximum amplitude, you see those short little transients. They're called transient because they are very short in duration. Those are the peaks of, in this case, I'm sure it's the kick drum. And those transients are such short duration that they can safely be capped or limited. They're no more than 70 milliseconds in duration. So if you cap it, even though you lose that information to some extent, it's not going to really be audible because it's too short of a duration for you to hear that loss of information. So what we'll do is we will look at the loudest part of the track and apply limiting to the loudest part. And the most limiting we can apply to the loudest track, we can then be sure that it should sound fine for the rest of the track, because the rest of the track is quieter and we're not going to be rounding off or cutting off any more information. We're going to be cutting off less than the loudest part of the track. So we shall put in a limiter. Looking at these peaks, we can clearly see where it's -3 decibels and a little bit higher. Those peaks can be safely rounded off because they're just way too high. And there's too much dynamic range in those tiny little peaks than we really need. So we can, I'm sure, safely give at least 3 to 4 decibels and cut off those peaks, and it should sound fine. And for the output ceiling, we would typically set it at something like -0.3. You don't need to know why it's -0.3, but just don't put it at 0. And as for the release characteristic, this is often handled automatically. In this case, it is. But what it does is it determines when the limiter kicks in and then releases. And the faster the release, the better you often preserve the percussiveness and dynamics of the track. Over here, you have a dithering option, which often comes with limiters, and this should only be applied as the very last effect. So if you're using your limiter and for some reason you end up producing other effects on either that track or the entire track at a later time, which is not typical. Typically, the limiter should be their very last effect. The reason why it should be only applied at the very end is because this adds a little bit of noise. That's all it does. It just adds a very low level amount of noise. And the reason why is because those very quiet parts in your track, like reverb tails and ultra low elements that you can hear in the background, those elements can sound very brittle and ill-defined because of a digital process that makes it sound not so good when you process it this way. And what dither does is it adds noise. It's very similar to when you have, say, a GIF image of a blocky looking picture, and it has different colors, and it's very blocky looking, but when you apply a little bit of noise, it sort of averages out and papers over those blocky demarcation lines, and it makes it seem a little bit less of a pixelated image. So it's very much similar in audio production, dithering. Now, this is how limiting would be used in the context of an entire mix. Sometimes you'll hear people say that limiters are only for mastering and that you absolutely shouldn't and can't use it for a individual track or bus tracks, group tracks that are put together before the final output. And you should always be careful whenever somebody tells you you can't do something, especially when you're talking about art. There is a science to mixing, but there's also art to music. And the worst thing you can have is not a broken mix that sounds bad to a mastering engineer. The worst thing you can have is a bland mix that sounds the same as every other mix out there. So whenever somebody tells you you absolutely can't apply a process to your tracks, always consider the fact that it's never a good idea to listen to other people telling you what you can and can't do. Trust your ears, and if you like the effect produced, then go right on ahead. With that said, you should realize that it's very easy to overdo the effect, and in some cases, it'd be very hard to see how it'd be worth using. If you have a very dynamic, subtle guitar part, or something like a folk song, or classical music, those kinds of genres don't lend themselves very well to something like limiting, because inherently those tracks don't need a lot of loudness. And furthermore, the listeners of those kinds of music tend to prefer dynamics. That's kind of the value of that kind of music. But if you're working on electronic music, hip hop, pop, any kind of radio type of format, it's kind of an open game. You could apply limiting to grouped synthesizers, guitar tracks, certainly drum buses. I see that a lot. A lot of engineers will secretly do that, and you won't realize it until you see their effect chains. So, for example, if you're putting limiting on a drum bus, in this case, it's just a kick drum, sometimes you'll have peaks, just like in a complete final mix, that artificially keep the audio quiet. So here's a peak, for example, in a kick drum that is very short in duration. But if we use that peak as a limit to the maximum amplitude of this particular sound, this kick drum is always going to sound too quiet. But if we limit it, even in a way that is subtle, we can confidently increase maximum amplitude of that sound while at the same time not really removing any important information from it. So again, I see the peak here before that transient is about minus 7 dB, so I can confidently cap off that transient by about 7 dBs. I know I'm not going to ruin my sound. And there you go. this has not been capped. It's still preserved, but this peak, which is extremely short in duration, is the only part that's been capped, and you won't hear that. The sound just sounds fine, and we've achieved a maximum amplitude for this. In this particular case, it's just one kick drum. But if it was a drum bus, then your drums, in principle, can be mixed louder in the mix. This could often make it easier at the mastering stage to get an even loudness distributed throughout the track. So again, there's no hard and fast rules. Try it out, see how it sounds in your mix, and you don't have to be so judicious. You can pump it a little bit higher and try to maybe get a little bit of distortion in there. And if you have a square-shaped waveform at the end, if it sounds good in the mix, and if it gives your mix that particular character that you can't achieve otherwise, then who am I to say that you shouldn't use that effect? So experiment with limiting, understand its issues that it can produce with your mix. By all means, try to use limiting at different stages in your mix while leaving most of it for the mastering stage.